was to be a doctor and there was no science laboratory in your school. And how could you get an equal education if it took you, let's say, an hour to get to school? And white students across town had been to school an hour before you. You were already behind by the time you got to the door. There were no school buses. So there were some real practical reasons why the NAACP, why Charles Scott's father and his uncle and others who were attorneys, why my dad was willing to join the other parents, very practical reasons why. And largely it was about realizing the promise of what this country talks about. Many of you are going to be able to vote in a few short years. The 11th graders obviously are going to be able to vote sooner than the 6th graders. I'm bringing this up because the critical part of the right to vote is that it gives you a voice in what happens to you in your everyday life. And I'm afraid we don't understand it at a very personal level. But what happens in Washington, D.C., what happens in the school boards in your communities, what happens in City Hall in your community affects your everyday life on a very practical level. The water that comes out of your faucet, those policies are determined by city governments. Your ability to travel freely determined by the Department of Transportation from the United States government. So our rights to be full participants requires that we not only learn about things like Brown v. Board of Education, but we understand that we are part of this whole continuum of making this nation work for all people.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Mr. Delane? Are you ready?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so our next speaker will be Mr. Brummett Delane. He's representing his family, who was involved in the Briggs v. Elliott case from Somerton, South Carolina.
Good morning, everyone. The case from Somerton, South Carolina was known as Briggs v. Elliott. Somerton, unlike some of the other areas where cases came from that were a part of Brown, is a poor rural community in the southeast corner of the Midland section of South Carolina. That case was started because the parents wanted bus transportation for their students. There were some students in high school who had to walk as much as 10 miles each way to school, and that prompted the parents to take a stand. Now, taking a stand in an area like Somerton, South Carolina is was during the 1940s, a very risky proposition. But those parents stepped forward and started a movement that led to the Briggs case that challenged the constitutionality of separate but equal. My father had the honor of leading that case. He was not a plaintiff. There were, in the final case that went to the Supreme Court, there were 20 plaintiffs representing minor children in school seeking equalization of the schools. Now, when you start a movement like that in a place like Somerton, South Carolina, that's a very risky business. The parents knew that, and they knew that there was the potential of harm coming to parents. That did not deter them. My father was not a signer of the petition, but he was the key person leading the case, along with 3 other ministers. When we look at the results of the Brown decision, we have to remember that it took a lot of people, supporters, to achieve what was achieved in that Supreme Court case. So even though I'm going to talk primarily about my father, I don't want us to forget about those other people who risked so much and suffered greatly for their efforts to benefit us today. In my father's case, he was a minister and a teacher. After filing the Briggs case, it wasn't long before he was just a minister, because he was fired as a teacher, along with several other people in the community, including some of his sisters and niece. My mother eventually was fired, but that was later in the case. some of the difficulties that were experienced are reprisals. 1951, our house was burned. We moved to Lake City, but Dad stayed very involved in the Somerton area. Lake City was about 45 miles away from Somerton, and it required a commute to Somerton whenever there were activities that he was involved in. Most of the parents who signed the case were fired, evicted, or other reprisals taken that made it very difficult to survive. Daddy was a person who, he was a minister, but his philosophy of religion and social philosophy was intertwined, as well as his educational philosophy. He believed that God helped those who help themselves, and that was what he constantly pushed, that the residents of the area had to do something for themselves instead of sitting back waiting for the white establishment to take care of them, because it was obvious that they were not going to take care of them. The case was pursued through court, and after the Supreme Court decision in 1954 ruling that segregation was unconstitutional, there were several efforts made to make life quite uncomfortable for my father. In September of 1955, he received notice to get out of town, or he was going to be murdered. He didn't leave. He was given 10 days. On the 7th day, his church was burned, where he was pastoring at that time. On the 10th day, there was a shooting incident that resulted in my father having to leave South Carolina rather hastily, and he ended up in New York. When he got in New York was right at the time that the segregationists in South Carolina were trying to starve the African American people out, and there were food drives across the North organized to provide food and clothing for the people of South Carolina. Daddy stayed in New York until 1971 and moved back to Charlotte. When he moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, there was still a warrant out for his arrest that remained on the books until the year 2000. That was 26 years after his death. Now, I say all of this to remind everyone today that there were serious reprisals and serious prices made to accomplish what was accomplished to make life better for us today. And when we think about where we are today and where we need to go, it's important to remember that we got here on somebody else's blood, sweat, and tears. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Delane. Okay, our last panelist that's going to speak today is going to be Mr. John Stokes, who is with us in Washington, D.C. Mr. Stokes?
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.